Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Dan Blanchard with the Travel in Time with Dan show, where we mix travel with history and with leadership, and of course with me, Dan Blanchard. Today I am at Holly Pond and Stamford, and I want to talk to you about Elizabeth Clawson of Stamford, which was accused of being a witch in 1692 here in Connecticut, Stamford, Connecticut. 1692, by the way, is the same year as the much more famous Salem Witch Trials up in Massachusetts. But let me just tell you something. Connecticut had their witch trials decades before the famous Salem, Massachusetts. Salem, Massachusetts gets all the glory or the fame, or people know Salem, they don't really know Connecticut. But Connecticut had a witch hysteria back from 1647 to 1663, and Salem's big one was 1692. So we're talking decades before. Connecticut even had Alcee Young, which was the first witch execution in the American colonies, and that was right here in Connecticut in 1647. Remember, Salem was 1692. That's almost 50 years, 45 years later, right? So now listen, I'm telling you, the Salem's the same time as the Stamford case of Elizabeth Clawson that I'm talking to you about right now. All right, same year as the Salem trials. But I want you to remember this and realize this, that this right here, Stamford, Connecticut, is not Salem. Connecticut learned its lesson from the witch hysteria that they went through decades before Salem. Salem hadn't learned their lesson yet, but Connecticut did. They learned their lesson, right? And one of the lessons that Connecticut learned was that the legal system here in Connecticut can actually resist hysteria. Yes, they can. Salem couldn't do that at first. They started to learn to do that. And Salem doesn't learn to do that until many accusations later. The Massachusetts governor's wife is accused. And then that's when he says, oh, no, you don't. They're enough with this. We're putting an end to this. There's enough to this. But Salem had to go through a lot of that stuff. Here in 1692, Connecticut had already learned its lesson, right? And they knew how to resist. Their court systems knew how to resist the hysteria, the witch hysteria, right? So now listen, how does it get started here in Stamford, Connecticut? Well, listen, there's this Katherine Branch. She's a 17-year-old servant girl, right? And she has these fits, right? And in these fits, she says that she saw in her visions Elizabeth Clawson, right? And so that was enough. That was enough to get her accused. Anybody knows anything about Salem knows that was enough to get you accused, right? And not only enough to get you accused, but enough to get you found guilty. Because when you had these visions and these dreams, that was actually considered evidence, right? That's crazy, all right? Now, according to the historians, okay, they say that Elizabeth Clawson, she was not a witch. She was a 62-year-old grandma who was like a badass. Someone who spoke her mind, and when one lady gave her a hard time, she threw rocks at her, right? And she spoke her mind. And that got her, kind of some enemies, and people would actually quickly point at her as a witch, because the women were vulnerable those days to becoming witches, and supposedly, and obviously vulnerable to being accused and found guilty, all right? But the historians, according to historians, they say she was just a 62-year-old grandmother badass. That's what she was. And now, I read an article from Deborah Bruno that said the same thing. She's right. She's like Elizabeth Clawson was just a badass. And by the way, who's Deborah Bruno? Deborah Bruno is the 10-time great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Clawson. So that makes the Stamford Witch the 10-time great-grandmother of Deborah Bruno. So that's like, great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. So imagine that, right? Right, so her 10-time great-granddaughter says obviously she was not a witch, she was just a badass. That's exactly what the historians say. Now today, I'm at Holly Pond, all right? So Holly Pond's very important here. Holly Pond is where they got the water ordeal, all right, in Stamford, Connecticut. They threw the accused in, and if these women sank, then I guess they were innocent, but then they died from drowning. If they floated, then they're witches, right? They're witches. And Elizabeth Clawson floated like a cork. So she was a witch, right? But here's where things get different, all right? Different from Salem. When she goes to court, the judge takes meticulous notes, right? But he refuses to make a decision because 76 of her neighbors came out and signed petitions saying she's just a grumpy old woman. She's not a witch, right? So this case with the meticulous notes gets referred to Hartford. Stamford Court doesn't make a decision on it. Send it to Hartford General Court, where the Hartford General Court says, you know what? Spectral evidence, the fits, the visions, the dreams, which Salem accepted as evidence, not here in Connecticut. No, that's not going to be legal evidence here in Connecticut. And the Hartford General Court's going to say, that's not enough. You need something more to prove that she is a witch, because this stuff doesn't fit, right? And eventually, in Salem, Massachusetts, when the governor's wife gets accused, he too is going to say, oh, no, probably leans on Connecticut's case and says, the fits, the spectral evidence, the fits, the visions is not enough, right? All right, so after 5 months in jail, Elizabeth Clawson, the Stamford accused witch, she gets acquitted, right? And they say basically she's grumpy, not a witch. And this woman ended up living to 82. So finally, common sense over the mob prevailed here in Stamford, Connecticut. And it's going to take Salem a while to get there, but they're going to use Connecticut as precedence and follow Connecticut's lead eventually after 20 females are killed as witches in Salem. All right? But again, Connecticut's way ahead, but the history books don't tell you about Connecticut. They just tell you about Salem. So, when I do my shows of Travel in Time with Dan, I like to include travel, history, and leadership, and of course me. If you've not been down here, how cool to come down here to the place where they used to chuck the ladies in the water. I mean, sad for them, of course. It's so unfair for them, but just to see this kind of history right here, Halley Pond. Very cool. You should definitely travel down here. Check this place out. I've already given you a little history. So what's the leadership of all this? Well, the leadership would be this. Independent thinking versus groupthink. All right? Do you follow the crowd or do you think for yourself? Right? Do you question what everybody else believes? Right? Or do you just go with the groupthink and say, yeah, she's a witch because she's different, right? She's smart, or she's cranky, or grumpy, or she's outspoken, right? You just go with the groupthink and say she's a witch, or do you think for yourself? So the leadership is independent thinking, right, over groupthink. And independent thinking becomes very difficult when there's groupthink. Very difficult. You have to be a real strong leader to be able to do your independent thinking over groupthink. But if you're going to be a great leader, you have to do independent thinking. By the way, if they had done independent thinking, they would have seen that the 17-year-old Katherine Branch probably was just having epileptic fits, not fits put on her by some witch. All right, they were epileptic fits, and independent thinking might have figured that out. All right. So anyways, thanks for spending time with me today on the Travel in Time with Dan show here at Halley Pond in Stamford, when we talked about the Stamford witch, right, who really wasn't just a witch, just accused of being a witch. And I'll be back again real soon with another Travel in Time with Dan show, where we mix travel with history and with leadership, and of course with me, Dan Blanchard. And until then, you take care, and I'll see you soon.